October 15, 2023, a teacher humiliated a deaf girl in front of her entire class, then had her expelled for disrupting the learning environment. But what no one expected was that a retired federal judge sitting in the back of the courtroom would refuse to let this injustice stand. When this judge stepped in, the school's carefully constructed narrative collapsed completely, and it exposed a system that had been silencing vulnerable students for years. But here's the question everyone's asking. How many other children are being punished for disabilities the system refused to accommodate in the first place? The hallways of Riverside Academy thrummed with the kind of controlled chaos that only a private school could manage. Glass doors reflected sunlight onto polished concrete floors. Motivational posters lined the walls. Excellence through discipline. Your future starts now. We build leaders here. The school's tagline was emblazoned above the main office in bronze letters. Where potential meets purpose. Riverside Academy sat on the edge of a wealthy suburb, the kind of place where tuition payments came without hesitation and parent-teacher conferences were more about networking than accountability. The school had a reputation, not just for academics but for exclusivity, for maintaining a certain standard, for producing graduates who went to Ivy League universities and prestigious law firms, for being, in the words of their marketing materials, a beacon of educational excellence in an increasingly challenging world. But excellence, as it turned out, had specific parameters. 17-year-old Sophie Martinez had been deaf since birth. Not profoundly deaf in the way that movies sometimes portrayed it. She wasn't living in a silent vacuum. Rather, Sophie existed in a world of selective sound. She wore advanced hearing aids that amplified certain frequencies, and she had learned to read lips with a precision that most hearing people would find remarkable. She could speak, though her voice sometimes carried the slight flatness of someone who had learned to produce sound without fully hearing it herself. She had lived her entire life navigating spaces designed for hearing people, constantly translating, always working twice as hard, perpetually proving that she belonged. Sophie had gotten into Riverside Academy on her own merit. A 3.8 GPA. Perfect SAT scores. Essays that her guidance counselor said were among the best she'd seen in 30 years of counseling. Sophie had earned her spot. She'd also had to fight for it. During her campus interview, 3 separate administrators had asked, in slightly different ways, whether she was sure she could handle the rigorous academic environment. One had suggested, with what he clearly believed was kindness, that she might be more comfortable at a school with more accommodations for students with special needs. Sophie had politely reminded him that deafness was an auditory difference, not an intellectual one. She'd gotten in anyway. Now, 3 months into her senior year, she was sitting in Mr. Derek Thompson's AP American History class on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The classroom itself was modern, with large windows that overlooked the school's manicured grounds and a projection screen at the front, where Mr. Thompson displayed slides of his lectures. Sophie sat in the 3rd row, her transcription service, a real-time captioning system provided by the school as part of her accommodation plan, glowing on the small laptop in front of her. Mr. Thompson was 53 years old, tenured, and considered one of the school's most popular teachers. He had been at Riverside for 22 years. He'd won a teaching award 3 years running. He had photos on his office wall of former students, now successful lawyers and businesspeople, thanking him for inspiring them. He believed genuinely that he cared about his students. He also believed equally genuinely that accommodations for students with disabilities were sometimes taken advantage of and that real learning happened through challenge and struggle. He had never, in 22 years, had a deaf student in his class before Sophie. On this particular Tuesday, Mr. Thompson was lecturing about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He was making a point about how the law had leveled the playing field, how it had created a system where everyone theoretically had equal opportunity. He was mid-sentence when he noticed Sophie looking at her transcription laptop instead of at him. "Sophie," he said, his voice taking on an edge of irritation. "Eyes forward, please." Sophie looked up, confused. She needed to look at the laptop to read the captions. She also needed to look at his lips to fill in any gaps the transcription service missed, or to catch tone and nuance. This was her accommodation. This was how she learned. She'd explained this to every teacher on the first day of class. It had been in her accommodation letter, sent to all faculty members at the start of the year. "I'm reading the captions," Sophie said, keeping her voice level. Mr. Thompson stopped mid-lecture. "The captions," he repeated, as though the word itself was absurd. He looked around the room at the other 32 students, all of whom had suddenly become very interested in their desks. "Sophie, when I'm teaching, I expect my students to look at me, not on a computer screen. It's disrespectful." Sophie felt her chest tighten. She took a breath. "The captions are my accommodation," she said carefully. "I need to read them while I listen." "You need to be present," Mr. Thompson interrupted. His voice wasn't angry exactly. It was the tone of a teacher correcting a student who simply didn't understand the rules. Reasonable. Disappointed. "If you can't manage that, then you're not getting the full educational experience of this class." What Sophie heard underneath his words was something different from what he'd actually said. What she heard was, "Your presence here is conditional. You have to work harder than everyone else, prove yourself more, jump through more hoops, and even then you might not be welcome." She'd heard variations of this message her entire life. In elementary school, when teachers suggested she might do better in a different type of school. In middle school, when a coach told her she couldn't be on the swim team because her hearing aids couldn't get wet. In high school, she wasn't invited to a group project because a student told her, very gently, that they were worried about communication barriers. Sophie had learned to swallow these moments, to take them as fuel, to prove over and over again that she was just as capable as anyone else. But something about sitting in this classroom, surrounded by students whose laptops and phones were constantly visible, whose distractions were constant and accepted, hearing a teacher tell her that her accommodation was disrespectful, something cracked a little. "I'm going to read the captions and listen to you at the same time," Sophie said quietly. "That's how I learn." The room had gone completely silent. Students were watching now, uncomfortable but unable to look away. Mr. Thompson's face reddened slightly. "That's not how this class works," he said flatly. "If you disrupt my classroom with your accommodation, then you need to find another class. My priority is to the 32 other students who are here to learn without interruption." The word accommodation, the way he said it, made it sound like a luxury, like a special favor, like Sophie was asking for something unreasonable. "I'm not disrupting anything," Sophie said. Her hands were shaking now, but her voice remained steady. This was another skill she'd learned, to appear calm while internally falling apart. "I'm trying to learn." "Then prove it," Mr. Thompson said, and turned back to the projection screen. "Now back to the Civil Rights Act. As I was saying, the goal of the law was to create equal opportunity for all Americans, regardless of race or color. The idea was that if we just removed the barriers, everyone would have a fair shot." He continued his lecture as though nothing had happened, as though Sophie hadn't just been told publicly that her disability was an inconvenience, as though the other 32 students weren't now shooting her looks, some sympathetic, most just relieved it wasn't them, as though the irony of his lecture about equal rights and removed barriers wasn't so thick it could have filled the room. Sophie read the captions. She looked at his lips. She took notes. She participated when called on. She did everything right, and she felt very clearly that none of it mattered. This was the world of Riverside Academy, a place that believed in excellence and potential and opportunity, a place that had forms and policies and accommodation letters, a place that, on paper, was committed to inclusion and accessibility. But underneath all of that, underneath the bronze letters and the motivational posters and the promise of a beacon of educational excellence, was a world that expected students like Sophie to prove themselves differently, to work harder, to be grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion they were offered, to understand that their needs were accommodations, not rights, to know their place. Sophie had accepted this world as simply how things were. She had learned to navigate it, to succeed within it, to smile and nod and pretend that being constantly questioned and constantly underestimated was just part of the experience. But on this Tuesday afternoon, sitting in AP American History while her teacher lectured about equal rights and removed barriers. Something shifted inside her. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be immediately visible to anyone watching, but a small seed of something, maybe anger, maybe just tired clarity, had been planted. She didn't know yet that this seed would grow, that it would eventually break open the entire system that had been designed to keep her small. She didn't know that a retired judge would walk into her life and refuse to accept the world as it was. All she knew was that she was tired of proving she belonged. The Tuesday incident wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Mr. Thompson found reasons to create conflict. During a group discussion, he asked Sophie questions, then immediately moved on before she could answer, claiming she was taking too long. When she raised her hand, he ignored it. When she emailed him with questions about assignments, he responded with curt, one-word answers. But most importantly, he began making comments, small, deniable comments, designed to undermine her credibility with the class. Some students seem to think accommodations mean they don't have to follow the same rules as everyone else, he said during a lecture, not looking at Sophie but making sure everyone else did. Not everyone has the executive function to manage multiple tasks at once, he said another day, right after Sophie had successfully led a group presentation. I appreciate enthusiasm, but let's not confuse participation with understanding, he said when Sophie answered a complex question correctly. Each comment was subtle enough that Sophie couldn't directly confront it without seeming oversensitive. Each one chipped away a little more at how the other students saw her. The sympathetic looks from those first few days turned cold. Classmates stopped sitting near her at lunch. When group projects were assigned, people found reasons to work with someone else. Sophie documented everything. She took screenshots of emails. She wrote down dates and times. She knew, somewhere deep in her gut, that this was leading somewhere. She just didn't know where. It happened on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after the first incident. The class was working on a debate assignment. Mr. Thompson had assigned students to opposing sides of a historical argument. Sophie was paired with another student, Marcus, who was clearly uncomfortable. He barely made eye contact during their preparation period. When they stood to present, he spoke while facing away from Sophie, making it impossible for her to read his lips. Midway through their argument, Sophie interjected with a fact she'd researched. It was correct. It strengthened their position. But as she spoke, she noticed Mr. Thompson's expression shift into something resembling satisfaction. "Stop," he said, cutting her off. "Sophie, where did you get that information?" "From the primary source document you assigned," Sophie said, confused. "The exact same document that Marcus was supposed to use?" Mr. Thompson's tone was accusatory now. "We worked on this together," Sophie said. "Did you?" Mr. Thompson said flatly. It wasn't a question. He turned to the class. "What Sophie is describing sounds a lot like academic dishonesty, using someone else's research and presenting it as her own." The room went silent. "That's not what happened," Sophie said, her voice rising slightly. "We collaborated. That's what you asked us to do. I asked you to collaborate on arguments, not to copy research," Mr. Thompson said. "Marcus, is this your research?" Marcus looked absolutely miserable. He was a good student, popular, with no history of conflict. He also had no idea what he was being asked to do. I'm not sure," he stammered. "You see," Mr. Thompson said to the class, "this is what happens when students don't understand academic integrity. Or perhaps," he looked directly at Sophie now, "when they think their accommodations excuse them from the same standards as everyone else." Sophie felt the floor tilt. "I didn't copy anything. We both did the research together. We both." "Sophie, I'm going to ask you to step outside," Mr. Thompson said. His voice had taken on the tone of a teacher who was very disappointed but also very certain. "We'll discuss this with the administration." That conversation with the administration took 20 minutes. Mr. Thompson presented his version. Sophie had plagiarized Marcus's research, presented it as collaborative work when really she was trying to inflate her own contribution, and when caught, had become defensive and hostile. He had witnesses. The entire class had seen her copying Marcus's work. The administrative team, led by Principal Richard Feldman, was sympathetic to Mr. Thompson. He was tenured, respected, and had never had problems before. Sophie was new, accommodated, and therefore, in some unspoken way, required closer scrutiny. They called her parents. They opened an academic integrity investigation. They suspended her from class pending the outcome. But they never asked Marcus what actually happened. They never looked at the collaborative document with both their names on it. They never asked any of the other students if they'd worked on research together. They accepted Mr. Thompson's narrative because it fit into a story they already believed. That Sophie was different, that her accommodations might be covering up something else, that her presence in their school required management. By Monday, the story had evolved. Sophie wasn't just a cheater. She was a cheater who was using her disability as a shield. A student who wanted accommodation but not accountability. A problem that needed to be solved. The investigation, if it could even be called that, took 1 week. At the end of it, Principal Feldman called Sophie's parents in for a meeting. "We've concluded," he said, reading from a prepared statement that suggested lawyers had been involved, "that Sophie Martinez has violated our academic integrity policy. We are recommending expulsion." Sophie's mother, Elena, went pale. Expulsion? Based on what evidence? Based on the fact that she plagiarized work and then misrepresented it as collaboration, Principal Feldman said. "She didn't plagiarize anything." Elena's voice was shaking. "She worked with Marcus on the research. I have the email chain. I have the document they created together." Principal Feldman shuffled papers. "The documentation is inconclusive. But Mr. Thompson, who has been with us for 22 years, has stated clearly that he believes academic dishonesty occurred." "He believes," Sophie's father, Michael, repeated slowly. "Not that he witnessed it. Not that he has proof. He believes." "In a case of he said, she said," Principal Feldman said carefully, "we have to weigh the credibility of the witnesses." He didn't need to finish that sentence. They all understood what he meant. Mr. Thompson's credibility weighed more than Sophie's. His word was currency. Hers was different. "You're expelling her based on belief, not evidence," Michael said. "We're expelling her based on the judgment of a trusted faculty member," Principal Feldman corrected. "And now, if you'll excuse me, I have another meeting." Sophie sat in the car on the way home, watching the school disappear in the side mirror. 3 months of proving herself. 3 months of working harder than everyone else. 3 months of being told she belonged, right up until the moment someone decided she didn't. No one had asked her side of the story. No one had looked at the evidence. No one had questioned Mr. Thompson. The system had spoken. And it had spoken in a language Sophie understood perfectly. "You don't belong here after all." Marcus Chun sat in the school cafeteria the day after Sophie's expulsion, unable to eat. He kept replaying the entire situation in his mind, each memory making his stomach tighten more. He'd known something was wrong the moment Mr. Thompson asked him those questions outside the classroom. He'd felt the trap closing but hadn't known how to escape it. When the principal asked if the research was his, he'd frozen. Mr. Thompson was standing right there, his face expectant. Marcus was a good student, popular, the kind of kid who didn't want trouble. He'd said nothing definitive, which Mr. Thompson had interpreted as confirmation. But that's not what it was. It was silence born from confusion and fear. Over the next 48 hours, Marcus watched as the story solidified at school. Sophie had cheated. Sophie had been dishonest. Sophie had tried to hide behind her disability. By Wednesday, most students had accepted this narrative without question. A few had even begun elaborating on it, saying they'd always suspected something was off with Sophie, that they'd never really trusted her anyway. Marcus knew none of it was true. On Thursday morning, he did something that terrified him. He went to Principal Feldman's office. "I need to talk to you about the Sophie Martinez situation," Marcus said, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't think what happened was fair." Principal Feldman looked up from his computer with an expression that suggested he was being interrupted. "Marcus, the investigation is closed. We've made our decision. But you didn't actually investigate, Marcus pressed on, finding courage from somewhere deep inside. Mr. Thompson told you Sophie plagiarized, but he never proved it. We worked on the research together. I can show you the document. We both added to it. We both wrote notes. Her name is literally on the file. Principal Feldman's expression shifted to something that looked like mild irritation. Marcus, I appreciate you trying to be honorable here, but you're a student. You don't understand how these investigations work. Mr. Thompson is a veteran teacher with an impeccable record. If he says plagiarism occurred, then we have to take that seriously. But he's the one who accused her in the first place, Marcus said, his voice getting stronger. Doesn't that mean he's not an objective witness? Principal Feldman set down his pen with deliberate slowness. Marcus, I'm going to be very direct with you. Sophie Martinez is no longer a student at Riverside Academy. That matter is resolved. What I need from you now is to move forward and not continue spreading rumors or confusion about the decision that's been made. Is that clear? It wasn't a question. It was a dismissal wrapped in administrative language. Marcus left the office knowing he'd been silenced. Not harshly, not dramatically, but effectively. He tried to tell the truth and had been told, essentially, that the truth didn't matter if it contradicted what the powerful had already decided. But he couldn't let it go. That evening, Marcus typed an email, not to the school, not to Principal Feldman, but to his grandfather, whom he'd been visiting every Sunday for the past 2 years. His grandfather, who had retired 5 years ago as a federal district judge. His grandfather, who had spent 40 years in a courtroom making decisions about what was true and what wasn't. Dear Grandpa, Marcus wrote, something happened at school that I think is really unfair, and I don't know what to do about it. There's this girl named Sophie who got expelled for plagiarism, but she didn't actually plagiarize anything. I worked with her on the project. The teacher accused her, and the school just believed him without looking at the evidence. I tried to tell the principal, but he said the investigation was over. I don't think that's right. I think Sophie should have had a real chance to defend herself. Can we talk about this? What Marcus didn't know was that his grandfather, Judge Harold Whitmore, had recently been growing frustrated with his retirement. After 40 years of ensuring that justice happened in his courtroom, he now spent his days golfing and reading and slowly realizing that the world outside his courthouse operated very differently. Those systems didn't always check themselves. That powerful people could make decisions without evidence and face no consequences. When Harold received Marcus's email, something in him shifted. Not anger exactly, but clarity, purpose he thought he'd left behind. He called Marcus that night. I want you to tell me everything, he said, and I want you to do something for me. Tomorrow, I want you to get a copy of that collaborative document and send it to me. I also want you to write down exactly what happened in that classroom and in the principal's office. Include dates. Include times. Include exactly what was said. But Grandpa, Marcus said hesitantly, the investigation is already over. The principal said. The investigation was not real, Judge Whitmore said quietly. Real investigations involve examining evidence. Real investigations involve hearing from the accused. What you're describing sounds like a predetermined conclusion looking for justification. And that's not an investigation. That's something else entirely. Marcus did exactly what his grandfather asked. By Friday morning, Judge Harold Whitmore had a complete picture of what had happened at Riverside Academy. And he had something else. A burning sense that the system had failed catastrophically. He placed a call to Sophie's parents. My name is Judge Harold Whitmore, he said when Elena answered. My grandson was in your daughter's class. I believe I can help. Judge Harold Whitmore didn't ask for permission. He simply showed up. On Monday morning, he walked into Riverside Academy's main office with a manila folder containing photocopies of emails, the collaborative research document with both Sophie's and Marcus's names on every file, Marcus's detailed written account, and a 4-page letter outlining what he'd identified as procedural violations and potential discrimination issues under the Americans with Disabilities Act. He asked to speak with Principal Feldman. He did not ask politely. He asked the way a man accustomed to people listening does. Principal Feldman was confused when his secretary told him a federal judge was in the waiting area. Confusion turned to something else when Judge Whitmore entered his office without waiting to be invited to sit. "I'm going to be direct," Judge Whitmore said, placing the folder on Feldman's desk. "You expelled a student based on plagiarism charges, but the evidence you've reviewed doesn't support that conclusion. In fact, the evidence you haven't reviewed, which I now have, directly contradicts your findings." Feldman's face flushed. "Judge, I appreciate your concern, but this is a school matter. We have our own procedures. You have procedures that appear designed to protect a tenured faculty member rather than ensure fairness." Judge Whitmore interrupted. "Open the folder." Feldman opened it slowly. His expression shifted as he read. The collaborative document was unmistakable. Both students' work visible, their names on every revision, timestamps showing simultaneous edits. The email chain proved they'd worked together from the beginning. "Mr. Thompson never showed this to me," Feldman said quietly. "No," Judge Whitmore agreed. "He didn't, because it contradicts his narrative." "This doesn't necessarily mean," Feldman began. "It means your investigation was incomplete," Judge Whitmore said. "It means you took one person's accusation as truth without gathering evidence. It means you expelled a disabled student based on the word of a tenured teacher without giving her an opportunity to present her side of the story. That's not procedure. That's biased." Feldman shifted in his chair. "What exactly are you asking for?" "I'm asking for Sophie Martinez to be reinstated immediately," Judge Whitmore said. "I'm asking for the expulsion to be removed from her record. And I'm asking for your investigation into her case to be reopened. Properly this time. That's not typically how—" "I'm not asking you to do what's typical," Judge Whitmore said coldly. "I'm informing you that if this isn't resolved, I will be filing a complaint with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, citing violation of ADA protections and discriminatory practices. I will be representing the family pro bono. And I will be requesting that a federal investigation be opened into how Riverside Academy handles students with disabilities." The color drained from Feldman's face. He knew what that meant. Federal oversight, potential loss of accreditation, lawsuits, the whole careful image of Riverside Academy crumbling. "I'll need to speak with our legal counsel," Feldman said. "You do that," Judge Whitmore said. "But you have 48 hours. After that, I file." He stood and walked out, leaving the folder behind. By that afternoon, Riverside Academy's lawyers had been consulted. By evening, they'd advised immediate action. By Tuesday morning, Feldman was calling Sophie's parents. "We've reopened the investigation," he said carefully, "and we've discovered some documentation that changes the nature of our findings." Elena nearly dropped the phone. "What are you saying?" "We're saying that the expulsion was premature, based on incomplete information." Michael took the phone from his wife. "Are you reversing the expulsion?" "Yes," Feldman said. "Effective immediately. Sophie is welcome to return to school. We apologize for the misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. That's what they were calling it. Sophie found out when her parents called her room where she'd been spending most of her time since the expulsion. Too humiliated to leave the house. "You can go back," her mother said and started crying. But going back meant something different now. That same Tuesday, before Sophie returned to class, something else happened. Mr. Thompson was called into a meeting with Principal Feldman, the school's legal counsel, and a representative from the district office. He was informed that a formal complaint had been filed against him, that a federal judge was prepared to pursue legal action if certain conditions weren't met. He was not fired. Riverside Academy's lawyers determined that firing him would look like admission of guilt and make them more vulnerable to litigation. Instead, Mr. Thompson was placed on administrative leave pending a formal review process. His teaching record was flagged. His tenure became less protective than he'd believed. By Wednesday morning, Sophie walked back into Riverside Academy. Her story had spread, not among administrators and lawyers, but among students. Marcus had told people. People had talked. By the time Sophie arrived, she was no longer the girl who cheated. She was the girl whose expulsion had been reversed. The girl a federal judge had fought for. The girl Mr. Thompson had tried to frame. The narrative had reversed completely. But reversal wasn't justice. Reversal was just the beginning of understanding what justice might look like. Judge Harold Whitmore sat in his study that Wednesday night, unable to sleep. The walls were lined with law books and framed photos from his 40 years on the bench, ceremonial photos mostly, the kind that came with the position. He realized, looking at them now, that he had no photos of actual justice. No images of people whose lives had changed because he'd made the right call. Just photos of himself looking authoritative. He'd expected to feel satisfied after forcing Riverside Academy's hand. Instead, he felt something closer to rage. Not at the school, but at himself. At 40 years of believing that justice happened inside a courtroom, within a system designed to be fair. Not recognizing, until his grandson brought it to him, that the real injustices happened in places where no judge was watching. In schools. In offices. In the thousands of small rooms where powerful people made decisions about powerless ones without accountability. He called his daughter the next morning. It was the first real conversation they'd had in months. Before that, they'd only exchanged pleasantries at family dinners. "I think I've been wrong about something," he said. For a very long time. Sophie sat in AP American History class on Thursday, and it was nothing like she'd imagined. She'd thought about this moment obsessively while on expulsion. She'd imagined walking triumphant, everyone acknowledging that she'd been wronged. Instead, she felt hollow. Mr. Thompson wasn't there. The class was taught by a substitute. But more unsettling was the reaction. Some students wouldn't make eye contact. Others offered sympathy that felt like pity. A few tried to act like nothing had happened, which somehow felt worse. At tea lunch, Marcus sat down across from her. "Hey," he said, "I wanted to tell you myself before you heard it somewhere else. My grandfather talked to my parents. He's going to help your family explore whether we need to do more than just get you back in school. He thinks Riverside might have violated federal law." Sophie picked at her food. "I don't want to have a legal case." "You're not," Marcus said carefully. "But what happened to you, it wasn't just about you. Mr. Thompson's been teaching here for 22 years. How many other students has he done this to? How many people never had a judge grandfather to fight back?" Sophie understood what he was saying. But understanding and feeling ready to be the poster child for systemic injustice were two different things. Mr. Thompson, on administrative leave, sat in his kitchen trying to understand what had gone wrong. In his mind, Sophie had been the problem. A student who was difficult to teach, who disrupted his classroom with her needs, who seemed to expect special treatment. But now, looking at the evidence that had been presented to him, evidence he hadn't even known existed, he had to confront something harder. He had fabricated the plagiarism charge. Not consciously, maybe, but he had decided she was dishonest, and then he had interpreted the collaborative work through that lens. He had convinced himself of her guilt without looking at the facts. The worst part was recognizing that he'd done this before. Not plagiarism cases necessarily, but smaller things. A student who was difficult. A parent who was demanding. A situation that was unclear. He had always sided with his own comfort, his own interpretation, his own sense of what was right. He didn't go to Riverside Academy's lawyers when they offered to help him navigate the complaint. Instead, he called a therapist. For the first time in his career, he began asking himself uncomfortable questions. Sophie's parents met with Judge Whitmore at his office the following week. The space was nothing like she'd expected. Not cold and imposing, but filled with natural light and old books that looked actually read rather than decorative. "I want to be honest with you," Judge Whitmore said to Elena and Michael. "I got involved in this because my grandson did. But the more I've looked at what happened to Sophie, the more I've realized this isn't just about one teacher or one school. It's systemic." He explained the options. They could pursue a federal complaint. They could file a civil suit. They could demand changes to how Riverside Academy handles accommodations and investigations. "What do you recommend?" Elena asked. Judge Whitmore paused. "I recommend asking Sophie what she wants, because this is her life, her reputation, her future. And the most important thing we can do is make sure she has agency in how it unfolds. Sophie, sitting next to her mother, felt something shift. Not resolution exactly, but recognition. She was being asked what she wanted instead of being told what was best for her. "I want other deaf students to not have to go through this," she said quietly. "I want the school to change, but I don't want it to be just about me proving I was right. I want them to actually understand why what they did was wrong." Judge Whitmore nodded slowly. "That's harder than a lawsuit," he said, "but it's more valuable." The negotiations took 3 months. Not because anyone was arguing against change, but because real structural change required careful planning. Judge Whitmore worked with Sophie's family and their legal team. Riverside Academy brought in education consultants and disability rights experts. The district sent representatives. Slowly, a new framework emerged. The first announcement came in early December at a mandatory faculty meeting. Principal Feldman, looking visibly uncomfortable but resolute, stood before the entire staff. "Effective immediately," he said, "Riverside Academy is implementing new procedures for academic integrity investigations. Any student accused of plagiarism or academic dishonesty will have the right to present evidence in their defense before any disciplinary decision is made. We are also requiring all investigations involving students with documented disabilities to include a specialist from our newly created ADA Compliance Office." The room was silent. Additionally, Feldman continued, "All faculty will be required to complete training on disability accommodations, implicit bias, and equitable investigation procedures. This training will be mandatory and ongoing. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action." He didn't mention Mr. Thompson's name. He didn't need to. Everyone knew who this was about. But the changes went deeper than procedures. Sophie worked with Judge Whitmore and a disability advocate named Dr. Lisa Chun to create something called the Student Advocacy Board. It was a group that included students with disabilities, parents, teachers, and community members. The board's role was to review cases where students felt they'd been treated unfairly due to their disability status. They had no authority to overturn decisions, but they had authority to investigate, to question, and to make recommendations to the administration. Sophie was asked to help lead it. She said yes, but only on one condition: that the board couldn't just focus on deaf students. It had to advocate for all students with disabilities, chronic illness, ADHD, mobility challenges, learning disabilities, everything. Systemic change meant broad change. By January, every teacher at Riverside Academy had received training. Judge Whitmore delivered part of it personally, sitting in the school's auditorium and speaking directly to faculty about what bias looked like, how it functioned, and how to recognize it in themselves. "The problem isn't that you're bad people," he told the assembled teachers. "The problem is that systems protect themselves. They make it easy to believe the narratives that preserve the status quo. Your job, going forward, is to question those narratives, to ask for evidence, to give students, all students, a real chance to be heard." Mr. Thompson attended the training from the back of the room, taking notes. He'd been assigned a mentor, an experienced teacher named Patricia Howard who'd been working in inclusive education for 15 years. They met every week. Patricia didn't minimize what he'd done. She also didn't demonize him. She simply showed him, case by case, how his assumptions had shaped his interpretations of student behavior. "You looked at Sophie and saw a problem," Patricia said during one of their sessions, "before you even taught her. So everything she did, you filtered through that lens. The question isn't whether you're a bad person. The question is, are you willing to change how you look?" Mr. Thompson eventually requested to teach Sophie's class again. Not because of forgiveness, but because he needed to practice seeing differently. Sophie had to decide whether to allow it. Judge Whitmore told her it was entirely her choice. "If he teaches the class, it sends a message," Sophie said, "that people can do harm and still stay in power." "They can," Judge Whitmore agreed. "That's the reality of the world. The question is whether his continued presence, paired with real change and accountability, could send a different message, that people can recognize their bias and work to change it." Sophie thought about it for a week. Then she said yes, but with conditions. There would be monthly check-ins with the ADA compliance officer. She would have the right to request his removal if she felt unsafe. And most importantly, he had to acknowledge publicly what he'd done. In February, in front of Sophie's AP American History class, Mr. Thompson stood and spoke. "I made assumptions about Sophie based on her disability," he said. "I treated her differently because she required accommodations. I failed to give her fair treatment in my classroom, and when she didn't fit the narrative I'd created, I doubled down by accusing her of plagiarism without evidence. I was wrong, not in small ways, in fundamental ways about who I was as a teacher. I'm working to change that. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm asking for the opportunity to do better." The room was completely silent. Sophie sat in her usual seat, reading the captions on her laptop, her face unreadable. After class, she approached him. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "But words don't fix anything. Actions do." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm staying." By spring, Riverside Academy looked different from the outside. But the real difference was internal. A system that had protected its own had been forced to examine itself. It wasn't perfect. Change never is. But it was real. 8 months later, on a warm September morning, Sophie stood in front of the Riverside Academy student body at assembly. She wasn't there to make a speech about overcoming adversity or inspiring others through her story. She was there as the student representative from the Student Advocacy Board, announcing the results of the first official review cycle. "We received 14 complaints this year," she said into the microphone, her voice steady. 7 from deaf and hard of hearing students. 3 from students with ADHD. 2 from students with chronic illness. 2 from students with learning disabilities. We investigated each one. We made recommendations. And I want to say directly, this system worked because we took students seriously. In the audience, Judge Whitmore sat next to his grandson Marcus. He'd been coming to Riverside Academy monthly since the formal changes took effect, not to oversee but to observe, to see if real change actually stuck, or if institutions eventually reverted to their old patterns when external pressure eased. So far, it hasn't. After assembly, Sophie ran into Mr. Thompson in the hallway. It was one of those moments that still felt slightly awkward, even after months of working together in the same class. "Good speech," he said. "The data really shows what's happening." "We're only 6 months in," Sophie replied. "It's still possible this all falls apart when I graduate." "It's possible," Mr. Thompson agreed, "which is why I'm training 3 other teachers on inclusive assessment practices. If change only lives in one person, it dies when they leave. I learned that the hard way." Sophie nodded. She and Mr. Thompson weren't friends. They would probably never be close. But they'd developed something more durable than forgiveness. A working relationship built on accountability and mutual commitment to different outcomes. Judge Whitmore had stopped golfing. Instead, he'd started consulting with schools across the state, helping them develop similar advocacy boards and training programs. He'd turned down 3 job offers to return to the bench. His wife asked him once why he wasn't interested anymore. "Because I spent 40 years inside the system," he said, "believing that justice happened there. But watching what happened to Sophie showed me that justice actually happens in the places that decide to hold themselves accountable before they have to, before they're forced. I want to help more schools make that choice." His daughter had taken a leave of absence from her own career to work with him. It was their first real project together since she was a teenager. Principal Feldman still ran Riverside Academy. He wasn't transformed into some enlightened educator. He was still a man who cared about the school's reputation and donor relationships. But something had shifted in his calculus. He'd learned that protecting the powerful actually created more problems than addressing issues early did. It was a practical lesson, not a moral one. But it led to the same outcome. A school that was genuinely more fair than it had been. He and Judge Whitmore had coffee once a month now. They didn't always agree, but they talked. And in those conversations, Feldman had begun to understand what actually good administration looked like. Marcus continued visiting his grandfather every Sunday. But now they didn't just talk. They worked. Marcus had become deeply interested in disability rights and was considering law school specifically to work in this area. He'd watched his own testimony shift a system. He wanted to know how to build systems that were harder to break. One Sunday, he asked his grandfather, "Do you think we actually changed things? Or just this one school?" Judge Whitmore considered it. "We changed this one school substantially. And because we did it publicly and documented how we did it, other schools are watching. Some are adopting similar models. Are we going to change the entire country? Probably not. But systemic change doesn't happen everywhere at once. It happens in pockets. And sometimes pockets become the new normal." Sophie graduated in June. On her last day at Riverside Academy, she received an award for leadership and service. Felt hollow at first. Then she remembered what Judge Whitmore had told her. Awards don't matter. What matters is whether you changed the actual experience of students who come after you. She had. The Student Advocacy Board was now run by 2 students who'd applied for the positions openly. Training for teachers had been formalized and was now mandatory every year. The collaborative research document policy was standard. Investigations of student conduct now required evidence, not just accusation. None of it was perfect. Biases still existed. Not all teachers had truly changed their perspectives. Some students still fell through cracks. But the architecture of the system had shifted. Protections existed now that hadn't before. At graduation, Sophie sat with her parents and watched the ceremony. Judge Whitmore was there too, seated in the back. When Sophie's name was called, the applause was long. She walked across the stage and received her diploma, not as the girl who'd been wronged, but as a young woman who'd refused to let that wronging be erased or forgotten. As she walked back to her seat, she glanced at the section where Mr. Thompson was sitting. He nodded at her. She nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was simply 2 people who had each chosen to be different than they'd been, and were living with the consequences and the possibilities of that choice. Outside the gymnasium, after the ceremony ended, Sophie stood with Judge Whitmore on the school's front lawn. "What's next for you?" he asked. "College." "Then I'm not sure," Sophie said. "But I know I want to keep doing this kind of work. Holding systems accountable." "You'll be good at it," Judge Whitmore said, "because you understand something most people don't. That being wronged and being silent about it is a choice. You chose differently." "So did you," Sophie said. "Yes," he agreed. "Late in life, but I did. That's the thing about systems, they rely on everyone staying silent. The moment someone refuses to, everything becomes possible." They stood together in the fading afternoon light, looking back at the building. Nothing looked different. The same glass doors, the same bronze letters, the same architecture of privilege and exclusivity. But inside, something fundamental had changed. Not perfected, not completed, but changed enough that the next person who faced injustice would have a structure to appeal to, would have people ready to listen, would have proof that systems could shift. And sometimes that's how change actually happens, not through grand transformations, but through one institution at a time, one person at a time, choosing accountability over convenience.